All right, I'm going to start by removing this air intake duct here. It's just going to give me more access to everything. Pop up all the push clips. Once they're off, you can twist it and wiggle it right out of the way. Now you can remove the 4 bolts that hold this engine cover on with a 5mm Allen. Remove the engine cover. Next, I'm going to come over here right by the mass airflow sensor and loosen up this clamp here. Now there are multiple other clamps on this air intake tube that you can loosen up, but I just think that this one is the easiest to get to, and it's going to create the most amount of space for us to remove this whole duct. And the other one that I want to remove is right by the throttle body. Loosen this one up. With both of those loosened up, we can remove this whole intake duct. The way I'm going to do that is by pushing back on this, get it off of the mass airflow sensor, pull it up. Before I go too far, I'm just going to take this hose off, wiggle it to break it free, and it should just slide right off. All right, now remove the air intake duct off of the throttle body. Just wiggle it back and forth and it should come free. There we go. Now I'm going to unplug the throttle body. Sometimes pliers can help with that. You just get a better grip on the connector. There we go. Set that aside. I'm also going to unplug this here. Set that aside as well. It looks like this wire is hooked on here underneath, so I'm just going to go ahead and pop this out. And I'm going to disconnect this hose just because this one can stay with the intake, but this one has to stay with the car. So take the hose clamp off, wheel it to break it free, and remove the hose. Now let's take this off with a 12mm socket. I'm going to put the bolt back where it belongs, that way I don't lose it. Take this off with a 10, and I'll do the same thing for this. I'm just going to move these aside, set them over here. So the hose that comes off of this canister goes right here to the main part of the intake, and the hose that comes off of the solenoid goes to this right here. Now at this point there are multiple things that need to happen in this area. So you'll see right there, there's a bolt hole that comes from the backside, and there's one right behind that black plastic piece which you can't see. I can't see it either. It's really difficult, but basically there's a bracket right back there that holds the intake down onto the engine block, and with two 12mm from the backside, we're going to have to loosen those up. So let's start by doing that. I'm going to sneak in my 1/4" ratchet back there. It's really hard to see, but once you break them free, they should actually just come out by hand, so at least there's that. I know it's really hard to tell what I'm doing, but I will show you once the bolts and the intake are all off. I can show you what I'm talking about. Okay, there's one. Okay, there we go. Here's bolt number 2. And now there are 2 more hoses to be disconnected. One is this one right here. Slide the hose clamp off. Give it a couple twists to break it free. And coolant will come out of here, so just be careful, and if you have a collection bucket to put underneath, that would be even better. For me, the system was already drained, so there isn't any coolant here. And then there's one more hose all the way in the back, which I'm actually going to wait to take off until the intake is loose, so I can pull it this way a little bit. The next thing I want to do is remove all the bolts and nuts that hold this intake down at the front here. They're all 12mm, and there's 2 nuts, 1 on each side, and then 3 bolts in the middle. I'm going to start in the middle and work my way out. Now we can grab the intake, lift up, pull it this way. You'll see a hose that's back here. Let's disconnect that one. Move the hose clamp off of it. For me, this hose clamp is kind of broken, so I'm just going to try and kind of peel it. I'm just going to try and twist it off of here, and I'll get a new one for reinstalling it. Okay, that's off. I'm going to deal with that clamp later. There's another hose back there to be disconnected. hose clamp came off, so, and remove it from the intake. Grab the intake, bring it to the side, and doing this, bringing it to the side, will actually allow us to not disconnect this coolant hose that comes on the back here. You can just set it aside and leave it right there where it is. With a 10mm, I'm going to unbolt the 3 bolts that are holding the solenoid in place. At this point, it's still connected with the electrical connector, but I'm going to pry it up. And this vehicle hasn't run in a while, so there's no oil in here. If your vehicle has just run, there will be oil in here. Remove the gasket, set it aside, and be careful not to get debris in these little passages here. But you want to reach back there and disconnect the electrical connector. But if you just press on it, it should come free. I'm going to turn it like this. And now hopefully I can get this screwdriver in there. Press on the tab to release the connector. There we go. I basically pried the locking tab up through the front of the connector. And here's your old variable valve timing solenoid. Now before I install the new one, I want to clean up this area here. Again, like I said, make sure that no debris made its way in. If any gasket material is still left on here, you can use a razor blade and very gently scrape it off. In my case, it's all good. Now take your new solenoid. I'm going to connect it first. Try to do it the same way that I disconnected it. The wire doesn't really have a lot of slack, so you have to press it down in there. There we go. That clicked into place. I'm going to slide this in, turn it around because it's upside down now. Grab your gasket and line it up. It can only go one way, so just make sure it lines up with all the bolt holes, which it does. Just going to make sure there's no debris. And what I'm going to do is actually start in this top bolt to make sure that it goes through the gasket as well as the bottom one. Okay, once these are through the gasket, you can line up the bolts with their bolt holes, press this down and start the 2 bolts in. Those are started. I'm going to start in this 3rd one as well. Now we can snug these up. I'm going to take my ratchet and just, once they're bottomed out, just give them a little snug. They don't have to be very tight. They're very small bolts. They can easily break. Perfect. Okay, let's get the intake back on. Now I removed the old gasket off of the lower intake, cleaned this up. It wasn't very dirty. I just took a rag to it, and if you have anything to scrape off like corrosion, you can just use a razor blade, but plug up the holes to make sure nothing goes in there. I do strongly recommend a new gasket. If you absolutely have to, you can reuse the old one, but again, I recommend a new gasket. And I cleaned up the underside of the intake as well. Now you can take the intake and slide it over to line it up with the lower intake. But before you actually put it on, let's connect the 2 hoses that went back here. So there was this one, and it's a very short hose, so it doesn't give you a lot of movement. Put the hose clamp back on, and let's get this one reconnected as well. I put a new hose clamp on it because the old one was broken. All right, make sure the hose gets pressed down all the way. Snug up the hose clamp. Okay, that's nice and tight. Now let's line up the upper intake with the lower intake. Slide it on, and I'm going to start in the mounting hardware up front here. 3 bolts and 2 nuts. Okay, make sure that all the threads are started by hand. That way none of them get cross-threaded. And before I tighten this up, the bolts have to go back on the back side of right there. So try to reach for them. Okay, I got one started. And I got the second one started. Now that these are both started and I bottomed them out by hand, let's tighten up the main ones. I'm just going to run them down with my impact and then I'll come back and torque them. Okay, let's torque them. So these get tightened to 14 foot-pounds, and there is a sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, double check them. Now, the same torque applies to those rear bolts, but I can't get a torque wrench in there, so it's just a bracket. I'm just going to tighten it up by hand. Okay, that's nice and tight. Second one's nice and tight. Perfect. Since I'm here, I'm going to reconnect my throttle body as well as this solenoid here. Clip the wiring harness back in, and I'm going to put back this hose right here. Let's put these two back on. This one had the 12mm bolt. This had the smaller 10mm. And reconnect the hoses, make sure they're going into their appropriate location. This right here came from this canister, and this one came from the little solenoid. Snug these up. Let's get this intake tube back in. Slide it over the throttle body back there. Make sure it seats itself properly. There we go. Slide it over the mass airflow sensor. Make sure it seats here as well. Make sure it's bottomed out on both ends. And don't forget about this PCV hose. Now let's tighten these two hose clamps. Perfect. Nice and snug. Now it's time to get the engine cover on. Line it up. Start in all 4 bolts that hold it on and snug them up. One last thing is to put back this intake duct, so sneak it past the battery cable, make sure it goes into the air filter housing right there. Line it up with all the push clips up front and put it in the push clips to hold it in. Perfect. At this point, you can turn on the engine, make sure everything runs properly, there are no check engine lights, and take it for a test drive.